Hello again. Welcome back. We're going to continue this week with the next book here that we're looking at, the next two really, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. For those of you here last week or who've been with us in church as we've begun this series of Bible book overviews, what we're doing is we're looking at one or two books of the Bible every week, taking a look at the overall content, the overall themes and overall messages. We're using as part of that a great video series off the internet from the Bible Project that looks at each book and puts it together for you in a graphic way. For material, those of you who have it, we sent out earlier an email PDFs. We'll also have links to these things that in the bottom that you can get at these files if you want for the printout, for the content, for the notes, for the study questions. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to drop them in the comments section, whether you're watching with us on YouTube or Facebook. With that, let's get right into it. This week, again, we're looking at 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And like 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, originally, Chronicles was that, a single volume, Chronicles. One larger work, mostly concerned with the reigns of David and Solomon, but it does cover all of the kings of the southern kingdom, so Judah. So you're talking broadly, most of the book covers a time period from about 1000 BC to 586 and just after. But there's a couple of interesting things about Chronicles that really stretch it out in terms of the time period it really covers. The first chapters of Chronicles, the first 8 chapters, in fact, if I remember correctly, are all genealogy. Starting with Adam, going down through the line to Noah, and then from Noah to his sons, and then from that to Abraham, and then to Jacob, all of the descendants of Jacob's clans, and what we come to know as the 12 tribes of Israel. That takes up the first chunk of Chronicles. And there's a couple of interesting reasons for that we'll get to in a moment. And then at the end of the book, there's this little coda, it's literally 9 verses, that talks about the conquering, the fall of Jerusalem, the exile, and then the beginning of the return under Cyrus. So really, if you're looking at the overall content of the book, what it's covering is from the beginning of time all the way to about 500 BC. Chronicles covers a pretty huge chunk of history, even if parts of it are only covered very briefly. We don't really know who the author of Chronicles is. However, the completion of the book probably happened sometime in the latter 500s BC, post when Cyrus issued that decree, which we actually have a rough date for. It's about 538 BC. So sometime after 538 BC is when Chronicles was written. And it's written with a purpose. It's written to retell the history of the people of Israel. That's one of the interesting things about Chronicles, is that in the Hebrew Bible, Chronicles is actually the last book. It's the last book because Jews consider it to be a summary of the entire Old Testament. And so you have the Old Testament, Genesis, through the last prophets, and then you get Chronicles, which is basically, in the Jewish eyes, a summary and a recap of everything that came before. And so what we have here is somebody who wrote this book wanting to get down on paper the history of the world broadly, yes, but also the history of God's people. And given the time that Chronicles was written, that makes perfect sense. You have a number of generations now of Jews that have grown up without a king, without a temple, most of them not living even within the promised land, so without a king, without a temple, without even a country. And the chronicler wants the people of God to remember their heritage, to remember who they are, to remember their history. Another thing that it goes out of its way to emphasize is the unity of God's people. That's a theme that comes up over and over again, sometimes quietly, sometimes more out front throughout Chronicles. The chronicler doesn't want the Jews, his readers, to think in terms of north and south. He doesn't want them thinking in terms of northern kingdom, southern kingdom, which was the reality of the Jewish people for centuries. I've done this before in Bible class here, so those of you who are regular attenders of Bible class will know what I'm doing here. But if the fall of Jerusalem happens in 586 BC, or that's when it happened, but if the fall of Jerusalem happened this year, the kingdom is divided after Solomon's death under Rehoboam. The kingdom is divided about 1600, 1620 BC, or excuse me, AD. You're talking a span of 4 centuries where the Jews as a people had been divided between north and south. That's a very long time. And the chronicler doesn't want the people to think in terms of that division. He wants them to think in terms of their common heritage, that they are all sons of God and sons of Abraham. A third major emphasis in the book is the importance of Israel's compliance and obedience to the law. And we see that in Kings, we see that in 1st and 2nd Samuel. The regular marker or critique of who is good and who is not by what we would refer to as secular standards. Did this person run the country well? Did this person have a great economy? What we see as the marker of good in Chronicles, just like Samuel, just like Kings, is were they faithful? Were the people faithful to the law? And the chronicler gives a ton of extra ink to those who strove to be faithful. He emphasizes the faithful acts of David. He emphasizes the faithful acts of Solomon. He emphasizes the reform efforts of kings like Asa and Jehoshaphat and Hezekiah and Josiah. That's one of the big emphases that we see. One thing that I didn't mention, actually, and I'm going to here really quick, back to the point about the unity of the people of God, that's actually a theme, just so you know, that's a theme that Jesus picks up in the New Testament. It's a theme that Paul picks up. And if you want some references, you can go check out Matthew chapter 3, verses 7 to 9, or Galatians 3, 26 to 29, Ephesians 3, 6. These are themes that are picked up that the people of God, even now in the New Testament era, don't think of yourselves by division. Think of yourselves as a unified body of believers under Christ. All right, with that, we'll get to the video. Following the video, we'll make, again, a few observations about the content of the video, just briefly bring up a couple of questions, and then that'll be that.
The books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. While they're 2 separate books in our Bibles, that division is not original. Due to scroll length, the book was divided in 2, but it was written as one book with one coherent storyline. Now, in our English Bibles, Chronicles comes after the books of Samuel and Kings, and most of Chronicles is actually repeat content from those books. And so most modern readers, when they come to Chronicles, they think, wait a minute, I just read all of this, and so they skip it. And that's a shame, because this book is really unique and important in the Bible. In the traditional Jewish ordering of the Bible, Chronicles is actually the last book because it summarizes all of the Jewish scriptures. The first word in the book is Adam, the first character at the beginning of the story, and then the last paragraph announces the return of Israel from exile. Now, we don't know who wrote this book, but we can tell from details within it, it was produced by somebody who lived a couple hundred years after the Israelites returned from the Babylonian exile. Now, for this author, Jerusalem and the temple were rebuilt some time ago, and as we learned from Ezra and Nehemiah, things were not going well. The great prophetic hope was that the city and the temple would be rebuilt, that God would come to live among his people, the Messianic king would come, and all the nations would come live under his peaceful rule, and none of that has happened. And so the author of Chronicles has reshaped these stories of David and Solomon and the kings of the past in order to provide a message of hope for the future. And we'll see that he's designed this book to emphasize 2 clear themes. First, the hope of the coming Messianic king, and second, the hope for a new temple. Let's just dive in and you'll see these themes all over the book. First Chronicles begins with 9 chapters of genealogies, long lists of names. And you'll read these and think that this is kind of boring, and that may be true for you, but actually they're very, very important. The author is summarizing here the whole storyline of the Old Testament by naming all of the key characters in the stories. And as he does so, he shapes the genealogies to emphasize 2 key lineages. First is the line of the promised Messianic king. So lots of space is dedicated to tracing the line of Judah that led all the way to King David, to whom the Messianic promise was given. And then from David, the author traces that line up into his own day. The other family line that receives lots of attention here is that of the priesthood, the descendants of Aaron, who, of course, served in the temple. And so right from the start, you can see the 2 main themes: the author's hope of the Messiah coming to build a new temple, and it's rooted in these ancient genealogies. Now, after that, the author moves into the stories about David, and most of these are going to be familiar to you from the book of Samuel, but again, there's some really important differences. So first of all, the author leaves out all of the negative stories about David, where he's portrayed as weak or immoral. So Saul chasing David around the desert and persecuting him, the story of David's adultery with Bathsheba and then murdering her husband, all of that is gone. And what's left are the stories that portray David as a good guy. And not only that, there's also new additional material that you won't find in the book of Samuel that shows David in a very positive light. So there's a large block of chapters where David makes preparations for the temple. He arranges resources and builders and Levites and choirs. And not only that, the author also portrays David as a Moses-like figure. God gives David plans for building the temple just as he gave plans to Moses for building the tabernacle. So why all this new material about David? The author's not trying to hide David's flaws. He knows that anybody can go read about them in the book of Samuel. Rather, he's trying to portray David as the ideal king in order to make him an image or a type of the future Messiah from the line of David. It's very similar to how Jeremiah or Ezekiel spoke of the coming Messiah as a new David. This is most clear in how the author retells the story of God's covenant promise to David in 1 Chronicles 17. When you compare this story with its parallel in 2 Samuel 7, you'll see that the author of Chronicles is highlighting that neither David, nor Solomon, nor any of the kings from his line were the Messianic king, and that when the Messiah does come, he will be a king like David. And so for this author, these stories about David from the past are what sustain his hope for the future. After David dies, we move into 2 Chronicles, which focuses on the kings that lived in Jerusalem. And again, there's lots of overlap with 1st and 2nd Kings, but there are many key differences. So the author has left out all of the stories about the kings of northern Israel, so he can just focus on the line of David. And there's lots of new material about these kings from David's line. He highlights the kings that were obedient to God, and he adds new stories about how their obedience led to success and God's blessing. But he also adds new stories about kings who were unfaithful to God. They didn't follow the Torah, they led Israel to worship idols, and these kings face horrible consequences, all leading up to Israel's exile, a mess of their own making. And so this whole section becomes a series of character studies where the author wants later generations of Israelites to learn from their family history, and so become faithful to their God and the Torah. Now, the book's conclusion is really unique, too. At the very end of the book, the king of the Persians is named Cyrus, and he tells the Israelites that they can go back home, return from exile, rebuild the city and the temple. And he says, last line of the book, "Whoever there is among you, of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up." And that's how the book ends, with an incomplete sentence. Now, of course, the author knows about the first return from exile and the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, but clearly in his view, the prophetic hopes of Israel were not fulfilled in those events. And so this incomplete ending shows that the author's hope is set on yet another return from exile, when the Messiah will finally come to rebuild the temple and restore God's people. And so the book of Chronicles, it's the final book of the Jewish scriptures. It ends by pointing forward. It calls God's people to look back in order to look ahead, because the past has become the source of hope for the future. So Chronicles concludes the Old Testament as a story in search of an ending, and that's what this book is all about.
We're going to cover just a couple of quick things here in the reaction to the video. One is just the point mentioned right away at the 22nd mark. Just a reminder for those reading the book, especially if you have somebody who's reading through for the first time, and they read through Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and everything's following in a nice chronological order. And you get to 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, and again, things generally are following in a very chronological order, and all of a sudden they get to Chronicles, and it's, wait, didn't I just read this? Yes. The content of Chronicles very much recaps a lot of what's in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. So just be aware of that. It was written in a later time by a different author. You almost can think of Chronicles relating to 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel is kind of like what the Gospels do in the New Testament. You read Matthew, and then you read Mark, you go, oh, didn't I just read a lot of this stuff? Oh, yeah. Told from a little different perspective by a different author. The same thing with Luke and the same thing with John. So that would be the difference, or if you want to say a relationship between what Chronicles has for content and then Samuel and Kings. They're telling the same basic story, just from a slightly different angle and a slightly different perspective. The big thing we're going to cover, though, here is something that's not really mentioned. Well, it is mentioned in the video, but the connection I'm going to make isn't mentioned in the video. In the video, starting at 122, they start talking about how the kings of the past had failed, and the writer's looking forward to that perfect messianic king and that new temple and priesthood that isn't going to fail. And we can make some observations there, but the connection that is so interesting. And you can dig into this after we're done here, and you can dig into this on your own, and maybe ask questions if you want to. Again, in the chat or in the comment section below, ask about some of this, and I'll be more than happy to give you some references. There are some really, really interesting parallels between Chronicles and the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament. If you look at Chronicles as asking the question, or at least looking forward to that more perfect king and temple and priesthood, and then you read Hebrews, Hebrews reads as a direct answer to Chronicles. The letter to the Hebrews reads as a book, okay, so Jews, we want to look for a king that is going to be faithful, perfectly faithful and not fail us. Well, there's Jesus. Or you're looking for this temple that's not going to fall into ruin, or this priesthood that's not going to become corrupt and not fail. Well, there's Jesus. And the whole of the letter to the Hebrews is talking about how Jesus is that more perfect priest, more perfect sanctuary, that more perfect tabernacle, that more perfect king and ruler. And as I said, it makes it for a very interesting answer to those questions in Chronicles. Again, 430 just notes again how the obedient kings are noticeably highlighted. 2 questions here at the end. Again, I'll read through them. Feel free to ask your questions or drop answers again in the comments section below. And if you need some clarification or you're looking for some dialogue, we'll do our best to get back to you and answer those questions. The first 9 chapters, the first question here, the first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles is all genealogies and family history. What purposes can you think of for recording all of this information? The second question is pointing you to 2 Chronicles 36, 15 to 23. And we're going to be asking people who want to discuss this to discuss the strong statements of judgment and law in the chronicler's words. Why was Israel judged? Why was the judgment so harsh? What lessons are there for us today as modern-day believers? And then, where do you see God's grace and mercy here? Even in this section of judgment, where do you see God's grace and mercy? So those will be the 2 questions. Again, if you have any questions or comments in general about the video or about comments that I made here about Chronicles, feel free to get a hold of me directly, email, chat, text. Drop the comments in the comments section below the video, and we will do our best to get back to you. Thank you for spending time with us today. May God bless your week, and we'll see you again soon.